Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Transforming Tomorrow. We are here today joined by Dr. Carolyn Strong and Kenny White, talking about some current issues as well as some existing issues that have happened around race in the U.S. So I just want to open up with just quick intros if we could. Carolyn, would you like to start us off just with a quick intro of who you are and why you're here today for this conversation?
Sure. My name is Carolyn Strong, and in addition to being a member of the S Square team, I'm also a lifelong educator and an author whose work typically focuses on bridging the discipline gap and anti-racist practices in schools.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Kenny, you want to share a little bit with the audience about who you are, my friend?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I am Kenny White, hailing from the Chicagoland area, former educator, now within the medical/social work hospital space for violence prevention, and pushing all things that are with inclusivity and equity.
Awesome. Today we are talking about race in America. There are so many conversations around this, whether we talk about race being a social construct or not. The facts are that whether it is a social construct or it is real or not, society perceives it as real. And it is something that we need to look at because there are gaps in how people are treated. There are gaps in what people have access to, specifically because of their skin color. So I want to just open it up with, how are you feeling right now? Both of you identify as people of color. What do you personally feel right now in our country? And I know that's a loaded question, but give it to me straight.
As a Black person, I don't really know where to start. There are a lot of things that are happening, a lot of changes that are happening that are not necessarily in alignment with my core belief system. So that is a challenge for me. I am trying to navigate it as best I can, as an educator, as a mom, as an activist, and as a member of several marginalized groups, if I were to take into account all of my intersections. So I'm kind of threading this line of trying to, you know, hold my peace and maintain my own sanity while at the same time not ignoring the part of me that automatically jumps to, how do we fix this? How do we make this right?
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that, Carolyn. Kenny, how about you? How are you feeling right now?
How I'm feeling, a bit like Miss Strong said, is like it's hard to um, sit in the moment of what's happening and not jump to the solutionalized aspect of it. However, in my thoughts and experiences, like, we have done this over and over again. We have seen where we've pushed for these progressive laws, policies, movements, systems within the workplace, outside the workplace. We've made progression, and then when it seems like we've taken 3 steps forward, we get pushed 6 steps back. Um, so personally, at the moment, I am personally choosing to focus on what I'm doing now within the community, within, you know, those that I'm a part of, the spaces that I'm a part of, and holding that safe space for people. And also, where do we go from here conversations, because it's mentally taxing to try to watch news outlets and hear the reports of just rolling back on everything that we've done over the course of these years, and it just be stripped away from us when we labored for them, when we pushed for them, when we lifted our voices and spoke for them to have, when we gave our voices on behalf of others. I think it's mentally taxing to sit and just, for me to just sit and just like think about the disappointment. So I'm personally choosing not to do that and just be reminded that we are still in a fight. That's the only way I can think of it right now. I'm not saying my method is right or anything like that, but sometimes just sitting in disappointment, just almost sometimes I can lose passion fatigue of why we are doing what we are doing.
Yeah. And for myself, being a white woman in society, right? I'm perceived as a white woman. I was raised as a white woman. I have the luxury and the privilege to potentially, if I wanted to, say, you know what? This isn't my fight, but it is my fight, right? And it is everyone's fight. And I have another layer to that where I have a son who is seen as a black man in America, right? He is multiracial. He has lots of different blood running through his veins, but America sees him as a black man in America.
Mm-hmm.
And to look at all of those components and to hear everything that's happening. And I know when we first got on this call, there was, did you hear about this? Like literally every 2 hours right now, we're getting a new update and something new coming in. And when we talk specifically about how it's impacting race and race relations in the country, there's so many identities being attacked right now. There's so many identities losing access to things. If we focus specifically on race relations, I want to talk about the most recent thing that just came out.
Basically, what it looks like is that part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was repealed. And it was the part where we talk about equal opportunity employment. And so I have nothing. We already knew that we dismantled DEI over the summer, so that was not a shock. And now we put all of the DEI practitioners that are federal employees on paid leave.
That's Executive Order 11246. And basically what it was Lyndon Johnson signed a bill that banned discrimination in hiring practices in the federal government. Now, with all of that, there was also, by the end of day today, all people in federal positions that focus specifically on DEI, that have it in their title, that focus on DEI, all positions in the federal government with those titles must be released by 4 p.m. Eastern time today.
And I remember, if I recall right, correct me if I'm wrong, that there was a plan, there was an ask for them to be laid off at some point and not return.
Correct. So all of that coming into this, I mean, when I asked how you were feeling, I'm at this stage of, it's almost like the 12 stages of grief. It's I don't know if I'm in the apathetic stage. I don't know if I'm in the angry stage. I don't know if I'm in the sad stage. I feel like I go through all 12 stages on a daily basis. Like every 24 hours, I circle through all the stages again. And just when I think I've come to terms with it, like, okay, well, this is how we have to move forward, then something else comes up and I'm like, what?
Yeah.
I'm wondering, how has this impacted some of your personal relationships?
Honestly, it hasn't. And I had this conversation in 2016, and I came to the conclusion that I clearly must be a unicorn riding on a griffin, because everybody was like, oh no, now I have to go through and purge my social media friends list, because I didn't realize that I was surrounded by so many people that were invested in not seeing my personal humanity, and I didn't know, and I did not have that problem. And I think that it's, for me, is because, for lack of a better phrase, I'm like this all the time. So, you know that. So there's really no way to be in a relationship with me of any sort and not have that part of your belief system become known very quickly. So taking that into consideration, it really hasn't impacted my personal relationships Other than I do have some friends that have explicitly stated, I'm not talking about this. I am in the phase of protecting my peace. As a member of the 92%, I did my part. And I'm not going to spend every single day rehashing the stuff that we knew was going to happen, which is why I cast my vote the way I did. And I can't argue with that. Because at this point, people have to do what they have to do, whatever that looks like, to protect their mental health.
Yeah.
I agree with that and have the same position where my personal space and friend groups is typically like-minded people, like myself. So when all of this stuff happens, it's really like I don't really have too many people that don't see why equity, inclusion, and being able to give back to our communities, especially Black and Brown, protecting them from not just a micro level but a macro level. Like those spaces, it wasn't a whole lot to be said, especially with what's happening now. Um, it's really been like we've got to ramp up what we've been doing. We got to make strategic ways to not rely on governmental affairs. As hard as that is, we have to just remain also vigilant and aware, because as we know, and we've seen this play out before, that once this president took office in his first term, there was racism and threats that were more overt that happened on college levels. There was all these different Confederate flags flying. People were more bold about racism before. So now we have to not just be on alert from other things that have happened in our society, but we also have to be alert and protective of one another that are happening in our workplaces, in places we just want to walk in and grab a cup of coffee or something like that. So we're adapting on a friendship level. It's like, we have to watch out for this and adapt. But like Dr. Strong said, most of those people that are for this movement of not caring to see color, not caring about what has happened in this country, I kind of rid those people out of my friendship circle a while ago. Right. So it's not something I'm really dealing with right now.
And you bring up a really good point, Kenny, of, that last statement of people who say, I don't see color or anything else. A lot of times people who say that are very well intended, right? Mm-hmm. It's, I don't see color. Let's just all move through this, right? In the words of Rodney King, can't we all just get along, right? Mm-hmm. And that in and of itself, and we talk about that a lot at Us Squared, but that in and of itself is a microaggression, because you're invalidating how different my life is compared to your life or Dr. Strong's life, simply because of the color of our skin, right?
Yeah,
and we need to we need to recognize and acknowledge that it doesn't mean just because you say it exists does not mean that you believe that it should exist. And I think that's the piece, right? That's why we talk about shame and blame, and admitting that something is happening in society does not mean that you have to feel guilty about it. Actually, the opposite. It's you have to admit it happened so that you can take those action steps, because you're not going to take action steps to fix something that you don't acknowledge is broken in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's a whole other topic, right? Because we talk about society's broken. It's not broken. It's working exactly the way it was originally intended to operate.
That part.
Right? So we need to have that conversation of when people say, oh my gosh, our society is broken. No, our society is operating exactly the way our founding fathers listened to the words. Founding fathers created it to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's another layer to it this time, though. And when we look at I don't even know what year it is anymore, 2025 versus 2016, there's a whole nother layer to it, because in 2016, it was, we're going to build the wall. And that was what it was kind of focused around that last time. And that never came to fruition, mostly because there was really no ability to control that happening on his end. But this time it was, I'm just going to deport you. And that there is some control over. So within 2 days of there being this transition of power, ICE is out where I live. I'm not sure about you, Kenny, but I'm in Chicago Southland, and they're out. You can see them. Grocery stores are empty. The kids didn't show up for school. There were situations where they were out last night, kind of patrolling the places where Latinx people typically work. So they were specifically targeting third shift workers that work in hospitals and hotels. And
Wow.
you work in hospitals. You've seen it. Have you seen it?
I have not seen it as of yet. However, I know I work for the University of Chicago, a level 1 trauma center on the South Side. So we have been prepared before this executive order have taken place. We have met with some of our Latinx lawyers that have partnered with us from in the hospital and externally, who have told us what to do if there are any ICE raids. We have kind of hashed out, the terminology of what's considered a public space, what's considered not a public space when it comes to patient spaces that they are not allowed in. So we're also printed out the rights cards, making sure we are giving it to people who are possibly undocumented or here on a refugee visa and things like that. So we've been in collaboration with a lot of legal teams regarding that space. I have not seen any just yet, but we are taking the precaution to make sure people are protected. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, when we talk about some of those pieces, the other thing that comes to my mind of the difference between the first term and now is the first term, it was a lot of, oh, but he won't really do that, right? Like when
Hmm.
people elected him in, it was, well, he won't, I mean, he's just talking, right? But now people who voted him in knew what he had done previously, knew that he pretty much lived up to every promise he said he was going to do, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like,
Or at least
you got to
try.
believe what he says this time, right?
Yeah.
And to me, it hits different. So when you said it hit different this time for society, it hits different for society. It also hits very different for me. And it hits
Hmm.
very different for my circles of people that I speak to of there's a higher level of grief and disappointment this time around in humanity as a whole.
Hmm.
Because it's like, well, people still chose, right? Now, here's the thing. I'm not here, and Us Squared is not here to say we need to pick a side.
Hmm.
What we need to do, though, is we need to pick the side of humanity. And one thing that I've been saying a lot recently is we talk about humankind, but there is no kindness left in humanity anymore.
Hmm.
When we are making decisions that we know are negatively impacting people for things that they cannot control, such as repealing the discrimination bill from Lyndon B. Johnson that we just talked about earlier, right? You cannot control what race you are born into this world as. It is based on genetics. You cannot control that, but we're going to punish people simply because of that. And let's not forget that 90% of the people who are in the US who are of Black African descent were brought here in their genealogy, not
Like,
by choice,
yeah.
through enslavement. So we're going to punish the people that we brought here to work for us and to punish against their will, but now we're going to continue to punish them by not giving opportunities and access to opportunities.
And the people that were here when we got here. Not just punishing
Exactly.
the people that we brought here, but punishing the people that we displaced when we got here.
Hmm.
It's going to impact everyone, whether you want it to or not. It's going to impact everyone. It's going to impact people who identify as white or society identifies as white as well. Because
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
we start deporting people, we're going to have less workers. We're going to have less people managing a lot of the things that, let's just put it out there honestly, people who look like me aren't willing to do those jobs.
Yeah. And I do want to make mention to like rolling back the DEI initiative in the White House. I mean that initiative just wasn't for black people.
No.
It was for a lot of different ethnicities But if you want to really think about it, it's like the things that affected Black people, the things that affected Hispanic and Latino people, the things that that affected the Native Indigenous people were all up under that. So when you roll back things like gun violence prevention, when you roll back things like hiring more diversity, that affects everything that falls up under that umbrella. So, in my thought, in my head, is just like we're we're still in a fight that it's not just us, it's not just Black people,
Mhm.
where you are fighting racism, but the person next to me has to not deal with the situation while I'm dealing with the situation or the consequences of a leader. And our situations may look differently. However, we're both still being harmed on a
Mhm.
community level. Um, so, like you guys said, I haven't seen anything specifically about Native Indigenous people, but I can bet rest assured that there will be something that is targeting, whether it's covert or overt. There's something that's
Absolutely.
going to be hurting them at some point, place, and time, and we have to take precaution and steps to help.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been, I know during his last term, there was discussion of let's make it back into Columbus Day, right? That would be a direct offense. Now, that
Mhm.
is something that impacts all of society. Because I remember growing up, I only thought of Christopher Columbus as the person who was amazing, right? I only thought of Thanksgiving as a joyous celebration that we saved the Native Americans. And in my childhood, it was the Indians, right? So, like all of those things, that would hurt our entire society if we go back to teaching that way of what happened. It's one of those pieces of now that we know this information, what are we going to do with it? And that's where I struggle because society had information and they still chose to move forward with this. So now all of these new pieces are coming up in education and so many different facets. What are we going to do as a people to move forward? And how can we do that in a way that's not going to increase defensiveness? Because we all know that if someone gets defensive because they feel like they're being attacked, then they're not going to listen. So how do we open up that conversation? And that's what we really try to focus on as much as possible is just having honest
Yeah.
conversations and saying, let's have these conversations and let's figure out what those action steps are and hold one another accountable for those action steps, aligning to our business values. And I mean, I know that all three of us have a background with education. We also all have a background with mental health and trauma, right? And there is so much trauma embedded in what is happening right now. And like you shared, Kenny, it's not just around race. At the same time, that is a large focus of our conversation for today. But I'm wondering what some of your thoughts are around trauma and race relations within the US right now.
Well, I remember very distinctly when President Obama was running. And at the time, my mother was, what year was that? That was 07, 08. So she was about 100, 101 at that time. And I told her, I was like, how did, like, I'll take you to vote. This has to be like a big deal for you to come from being born in 1909 to be able to vote for the first Black president. She refused to vote. She did not. She
Hmm.
said, do not take me. They are going to kill that man. And I don't want that on my conscience. She did not. She was like, as much as I would like to, I already know what this looks like. I've seen this play out. I've seen this scenario play out time and time and time and time again. They let you get just right there, and then they pull the rug out from under you. So, needless to say, she was very happy that it didn't play out that way. But the
Right.
fact that that was her belief And no matter what any of us said to her, and no matter how much reassuring we tried to do to her that we were living in a different time and it wasn't like that anymore, she did not go. She didn't. And that's one of the things I keep thinking about, or I kept thinking about as we entered into the summer of 2020. Like, dag, she was not wrong.
Right.
So it's hard for me to say go back to when I don't know that it ever fully left, because let's be honest,
That part.
people got way too comfortable way too fast with this new way of thinking.
Yeah. I was just going to ask, and I apologize, anyone listening, if you've ever met Gandhi, he's usually a sweet, very quiet dog, but I'm going to just point him out right now because he had his no puppy making surgery. He has his cone of shame on, and he's being obnoxious. So I apologize for Gandhi, who's not being so zen-like right now. So what I was thinking when you were saying that, Carolyn, was I wonder, did you ever have, and you mentioned this a little bit, but as you were telling your mom, it's not like that anymore. Did you have that moment of, wait, am I lying to my mom?
Of course,
or did you genuinely believe in that moment it's different?
I believe, I'll meet you in the middle. I believed that it was different enough that that wouldn't happen. And that is because, knowing the world that we live in, if memory serves, and correct me if I'm wrong, either of you, but he got Secret Service quicker than any other candidate in American history. It was like,
I believe that is true.
He announced on a Tuesday, and he had like a full detail by like the next Friday, because
the first time candidate. So Trump this time around had Secret Service before he announced, but that was his own doing. Right. That was his own doing, and it was a return, not his first run.
I think that has a lot to do with the fact that people know, whether we try to pretend or not, there is this underbelly of understanding of the type of world that we live in. So when I was trying to explain that to her, it was one of those things where, did I believe fully that we have ascended into a post-racial America? Absolutely not. But did I believe that we had progressed far enough for that not to happen? Absolutely. So I don't know if that's a yes and, I guess would be,
right,
or a yes but.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if I may share really quick, just talking about the trauma of generations, especially for millennials and Generation Z and those that come after. I remember when Trump took office in 2016, there were so many protests. There were so many outrages, like the generations, the baby boomers that came before us. So now it was for us to pick up the torch and say, we're going to fight. We're going to take the civil rights movement on. And if I recall right, we were a different generation. Like, we weren't taking no crap. That's just me being modest with my language. But we weren't taking crap. Like, we were marching the streets. We were mobilizing. You know, there were buildings being burnt down on behalf of people who lost their lives to police brutality. We were like, no, we're not tolerating this. So now to see this happening again from a legislative level, it's almost re-traumatizing and sending this generation back into a hypervigilance of, it's time to physically fight again if we have to. We're not our former generation. We're not taking water hoses. We're not taking your canine dogs. We're picking up whatever we have to pick up and fight. And don't get me wrong, sometimes that may be the case on Malcolm X's, behalf. But sometimes we can't forget the Martin Luther Kings of the world, where we still have to fight on a policy level. We still have to continue to fight on a legislative and a judicial level. However, when trauma sets in, sometimes it's like, we tried that already. What else do you want us to do? We took 3 steps forward. Now we got pushed back. So I can just imagine what some of our generation is thinking right now is like, how do we keep fighting if we fought for this? And now the former regime that we had to push to get things put in place because they really didn't believe it themselves. However, we had to convince them and show that our programs and our systems work, and they implemented it. But now they're out, and now they just snatched everything away. So now it's anger, it's hypervigilance, it's fear.
You bring up a great point,
I'm gonna push
Kenny.
back just for a second.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I think that duality that you're speaking of is not new. I think it's always been there. And I did kind of do a video on this before about that whole notion of we're not our ancestors and how that dichotomy of the movement has always been there, and we've always seen it. For every W.E.B. Du Bois there was a Booker T. For every W.E.B. Du Bois there was a Marcus Garvey. We're not going to talk about the fact that W.E.B. Du Bois fought with everybody, but I digress. And then so you went from Du Bois and Garvey to Malcolm and King. So there's always to SNCC and CORE. So there's always been the create policy end and the bash heads end. And the two have to meet in the middle to truly create change. So I just, when we say that these are not things that were happening before, I do always have to take a moment to push back to that, push back on that, because there are things that our ancestors did that I don't know that we could do now. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days. Half of us can't even stay off Twitter. So like, they're like, don't use Twitter. And you're like, but that's what I love. Like, so there is a certain amount of resilience and tenacity that existed in those generations before us that I cannot let us negate.
Yeah, thank you for correcting me on that. That's my apologies, because I cannot forget even the Chicago 1901 race riots, where they were going fists and blows and fighting with even some of the sundown towns that existed in Chicago, where they was trying to keep them from having jobs in the stockyards and stuff like that. So
or 1919, where everything kicked off because a black girl's toe went over the imaginary segregated line at, was it 35th Street Beach or North Avenue Beach? I can't remember which one it was.
I think it was 35th. I can't remember.
A toe went over and the beach went up.
And there are so many examples that are still, even in our lifetimes. This is not just things before our lifetimes, right? Like in our lifetimes, we've seen this exact same thing. And it's interesting that you bring up the dichotomy of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., right? And absolutely, I agree with you, Dr. Carolyn Strong, that it's been like, this has been something that's been throughout history. We've seen that, right? Even just the whole idea of, are we talking about Rosa Parks or are we talking about Ruby Bridges? Which one are we talking about, right? And guess what? There's a lot of people who were really important in this work, but didn't get their name out there for whatever reason, right? But I actually did a blog post on the idea of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, because the Martin Luther King response is typically out of trauma. The Martin Luther King response, the Malcolm X response is out of trauma. It's the fight back, right? And then the Martin Luther King response is the political way of it. Right. And it doesn't make either one right or wrong, but they're two very different responses. It depends on your personal lived experiences. If you look at the upbringing of Martin Luther King Jr. and the upbringing of Malcolm X, you will see how they both had extremely different lived experiences, which impacted their way of moving forward with the work. Just like every single one of our lived experiences are extremely different and impact the way we see the world. Things that we have experienced impact whether we are seeing things from a trauma response or we're seeing things from a different response.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's so important because as a society, there are a lot of people struggling with trauma right now and are having that trauma response, which is much more aggressive and defensive.
Mm-hmm.
A trauma response is much more emotional than a neutral or more of a political stance. There's very different responses. And I think it takes a lot of practice and skill development to be able to navigate through that trauma. And it takes a lot of self awareness and coaching and work. And we need to recognize how that trauma came to be in the first place. We can't just say, oh, that happened. That sucks. Let's move through it, figure it out. It's got to be a, was this caused from a systemic issue, a systematic issue? How can we repair this so that the next person doesn't have to experience the same trauma I experienced? And that's ultimately our goal as a society, is that our future generation doesn't have to deal with the same ish that we had to deal with.
Yeah.
But we're failing at that right now.
I mean, epigenetics is a thing.
Yeah. What is something that you hope people gathered from this conversation, or an action step that you want to invite someone to consider if they're listening to this? What would you recommend?
That's a good question.
Well, I think for me, it's important that those of us that are doing this work find that balance. It would be much easier to say than to actually do. To say, look, you've done your part. If they don't want to listen, let the chips fall where they may. But those of us that are in these fields and in these spaces clearly don't operate that way, because we wouldn't be here if we did. So part of what needs to happen now, per se, is figuring out that line of being able to continue to do the work, but protecting yourself at the same time, whether it be your physical well-being or your emotional well-being or your spiritual well-being.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. My steps, I would say, is I'm a firm believer in God, and one thing that He has given us the ability to do is love one another, which, like Dr. Martin Luther King said, will dismantle hate. And a lot of times, as we've seen in 2016, it took a lot of us through love, grace, and our own self sustainability was to put our hands forward to help kids get out of cages, and put our hands forward to help those that were in this country that came and are undocumented, to help them with life, with jobs and things like that, even when the government or state funding or programs would not back us up or back them up. So my thing is, figure out, however that looks, is how do you and your faith bring you to help someone even when you don't have the support on a mass level. It can be done. It's been done before. I'm seeing people, black and brown people, do it in my own community now, that sometimes they have to come out of their own pockets. Sometimes they have to partner or collaborate with other institutions to get what it means to advocate for other people. It can be done. It's unfortunate that we have to go back to those resolutions because there have been funding from government levels shut down for these things to happen. But love covers a multitude. So that's mine.
Thank you so much, both of you. And what I'm hearing and what I'd like to just offer is the idea of making sure that you have boundaries, right? And those boundaries are critical. And I think the other piece that I would like to just invite everyone to think about is, what are your personal values and what do you hold true for yourself? And if you can truly look through your values as you're making every decision, as you're navigating the world and staying true to those values, whatever they are, if you can look yourself in the eye every day when you look in the mirror and say, I am proud to be who I am, and I am proud for my future generations to hear the stories of what I'm doing, then you're doing what you need to be doing, whatever that is, right? So my point for all listeners is to really figure out what your personal values are and stay true to those. You're not here to prove your values to anyone else. You're not here to prove your worth to anyone else. And as unfortunate as it is, a lot of people in society, especially from marginalized groups, are in the space right now where they have to prove themselves. Kenny, Carolyn, thank you so much for a great conversation. And I really, really do hope to have many more of these in the future. And listeners, thank you again. Stay engaged, go out there and be your purpose. And just like my wall says, be the change that we need in the world.